Do you ever wonder what would happen if...
If you give a dad a podcast.
I'm what you call a nerdy fan. I nerd out at this stuff hardcore.
You'll hear me talk about anime on here. You'll hear me talk about Power Rangers. You'll hear me talk about wrestling on here.
Okay.
I had an axe handle with a Twisted Tea on it. It was right after that Twisted Tea video went viral. And man, they went out and grabbed it and smacked a dude in the head with it. It was so...
That's great. I'd like to think of this podcast as a nostalgia moment for me. It's a show where I can talk about whatever I want.
I'm a human animal chiropractor. There was a picture of me. It looked like I was on the side of a ramen box over in China. But
So I took my kids with me to Comic-Con.
I thought that was really cool.
Well, I don't know if my wife should listen to this podcast.
We'll cut that part out.
You hope. Be like, and then Robert said this.
If You Give a Dad a Podcast. Available now on all podcasting platforms.
Hey everyone, this is Brian Ferguson, the host of Bumps and Thumps, the talk of wrestling. We are on here today because of you, viewers and watchers like you. In order to continue the podcast, we need to monetize our YouTube channel so we can get guests on that require financial compensation. That's where viewers like you come in. If you subscribe today, we can get that number up to 1,000. And as an incentive, the 1,000th subscriber will receive a free t-shirt just like this and receive a book from the legendary George Schire on his Minnesota Golden Age of Wrestling, from Vern Gagne to the Road Warriors, signed by George Schire himself. So please get on there, tell your friends to subscribe today. And when you hit that 1,000 mark, you're going to get a t-shirt like this. I'm going to reach out to you. You're going to be coming on the show as a guest and receive that book, The Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling, from Vern Gagne to the Road Warriors, signed by George Schire. So get on there today, subscribe, and please enjoy the podcast. Thank you for joining another edition of Bumps and Thumps, the talk of wrestling. I'm Brian Ferguson. Today, we're doing a special edition of Bumps and Thumps. It's Saturday, February 4th, 2023. We're doing a remembrance of the Kenny J, the Sodbuster, who recently passed away this past Thursday. And I've got on here today my good friend, George Schire, the historian. George, thanks for coming on. I wore my shirt in honor of Kenny. He signed it here a couple years ago in Crusher Fest, and I'm so glad I went up there and did that now. Kenny, and I'm going to let you explain it, but I just want to do a little thing. Kenny is a very underrated enhanced talent, if you will. He's talked about a lot, but he really did a lot of things for the business and for wrestlers. And if we can go back a little bit, Kenny J, great guy, everybody loved him. But let's talk about how he got into the business, if you would, how he got started, and we'll kind of go from there.
Well, before you say that, I just want to do this. You kind of expounded on it when you said, about Kenny J and kind of underrated. And I think it's safe to say right out of the chute, Brian, that in a business as pro wrestling was then, and, let's face it, still is today, it is a business that is filled with egos. And to be a success in that business, you obviously need to have an ego, which I think you do in anything, in whatever profession. You need to be confident of yourself. You need to, probably boast and brag sometimes. But in a business that Kenny was in during his era, and we're talking the 60s into the 70s and well into the 80s, Kenny J, when I say that name, there are going to be some fans listening there say, who? And that's really unfair. It's sad. But here's the deal. Kenny did not have even that much of an ego. He was as down to earth a guy, as everyday guy that you could ever meet. He could have been your neighbor. He could have been a coworker. He could have been a guy you met at the bar. He could have been a guy you sat next to at a ball game. Wherever you met Kenny, there was no phoniness. There was no, I'm better than this guy sitting next to me. There was no ego at all. Kenny J was just a gentle, common man who literally had a great love for his family. He's got 3 children. I know Lori, his one daughter. I don't know his other children, but I do know Lori, and just a sweetheart. She is I've always seen her with her dad, and then Kenny's wife Diane. Oh my goodness, they've been married well over 51 years. I did have just a distinct pleasure, sadly, coming up almost a year ago now, celebrating with Kenny at the Bloomington Legion, the Savage Legion, I'm sorry, and celebrating his 85th birthday. And he was so happy. Kenny, if he saw you, you were his friend. Like I said, there was nothing phony about him. He was never attempting to say that I'm better than you or I did more than you, just a down-to-earth guy. So with that, it was very sad news when, and of course, when you're 85 years old, I mean, let's be honest, when all of us get closer to those 70s, 80s, and the 90s, it's not really a surprise anymore. But it's always a shock when you lose a friend. And Kenny, the world, wrestling world, the regular world, we all lost a good friend with Kenny. So to answer your question about some of his roots, his beginnings, Kenny was as ordinary as they can be. As I said, he grew up on a farm in a town called Holdingford, Minnesota. Now, I have to be honest with you, I've never heard of Holdingford. And Kenny told me that years ago about his very humble beginnings in this small town. And he graduated from high school in 1955, and he kind of got interested in wrestling a little bit. He had moved to Milwaukee, and he got involved with the wrestling business in kind of a weird way. He'd hooked up with a guy named Bud Hawkins, who was an old wrestler trainer of the day, somebody that most fans will never recognize the name. But there were 2 other guys, Billy Gells and Johnny Gilbert, and they were quite a tag team in the 60s themselves. But they kind of took Kenny under their wing and worked with him, some training at the gym. And it was nothing, nothing like the Vern Gagne camp or anything like that. It was, pretty raw for the period of time it was in. But Gells and Gilbert worked with him. And then a guy named Ed Farhat had kind of an influence. And Ed Farhat, for those in the know fans, was the Sheik out of Detroit. And he ran the Detroit territory for years. Ed Farhat was working as the Sheik back in the 50s. In fact, in those days, he was billed as the Sheik of Araby. And he still had all the regalia and stuff, But he took Kenny under his wing, and Kenny was working. This is so hard to believe, but Kenny was working as a heel. And there really was a storyline, an angle that was set up where the Sheik and Kenny J were going to defeat Gells and Gilbert for what was then the Midwest Tag Team Championship back in the mid to late 50s there. And that was the plan. But, as we know in pro wrestling, there are those little words that are above every lineup sheet in our programs that says program subject to change. And right around 1960 or so, Kenny got a call from one of his uncles. Actually, it's one of our uncles as well, that Uncle Sam. And Uncle Sam.
Yeah.
And Kenny was sent away into the army and served for a couple of years to his country, and God bless him for that. And then when he came back, he had started a landscaping business with his brother. I believe his brother's name was Eugene. And I never knew of him, but Kenny started a landscaping business with him, and that became a very lucrative thing for the Benkowski brothers. Kenny's real name was Benkowski, last name Benkowski.
Okay.
And so he and Eugene had started this business, and it became very lucrative. But Kenny had that wrestling bug in him a little bit, where he enjoyed dabbling in it, shall we say. And he actually got a hold of Wally Carbo and asked if there was any chances of him maybe kind of, working in the business. He never had any intention of becoming a full-time wrestler. And of course, we all know he didn't. Mm-hmm. He just wanted to have fun. And that was the way Kenny was. He was just a fun-loving guy. I can't tell you how I could expound on that he is the guy that if you could pick out anybody in a bar you want to have another beer with, it'd be Kenny. He's just that kind of guy.
Yeah.
So he got a hold of Carbo, and it started to be where the AWA would use Kenny as what became the term in the business, a jobber. Now, I want to clarify something right here. I know there are some fans out there, even some of my friends, who seem to take offense at the word jobber. A lot of people today say, well, we want to call them enhancement talent because they worked with the other talent and kind of enhanced their abilities and skills and put them over, so to speak. But I will tell you that Kenny J and many other jobbers that I've known, Kenny specifically, he was never, ever offended by that word.
Yeah.
That was his job, thus the name jobber. But that was his job, to go in the ring for whatever time frame, let his opponent win. Kenny would have his few moments like they all are supposed to get. But here was the difference between Kenny and so many other jobbers. First of all, I have nothing, and I've always had nothing but the utmost respect for any wrestler that has ever laced up a pair of boots, put on a pair of trunks, and gotten in the ring. Whether he was the worst wrestler on the planet or not, I applaud you, because it's something I wouldn't and couldn't do. Mm-hmm. And for what they do, I give them all my heartfelt thanks to the jobbers of the world. But here's the thing. There were a lot of jobbers, Kenny being one of them, that really were, in their own way, exceptionally talented. And Kenny was. And here's the unique thing. I'm a longtime AWA lover. And I've talked many times about the mainstays in the AWA. A mainstay being the wrestlers, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them in any territory, that are what all the storylines are built around. They seem to be the 3 or 4 or 5 wrestlers that are always there. And, in the AWA, we had the Crusher, we had Vern Gagne, we had Mad Dog Vachon, we had Larry Hennig, we had Nick Bockwinkel, and later on you could throw Billy Robinson there. They came, they never left. They were there. And every heel or baby face that came through eventually ended up in programs with those guys. Well, there's one mainstay that got forgotten, and that was Kenny J. Kenny J was the one jobber, with the exception of the late, great Scrap Iron George Gadaski, who in his own right was a quality wrestler who accepted his role as a jobber, and that's what he wanted to do. And Kenny J came to the AWA, and he never left the AWA. Yeah. And Brian, his role was, I mentioned he had that landscaping business. Mm-hmm. So he and his brother, they would be doing their landscaping job all day, long hours, early morning, late in the evening. Kenny would get a call from Wally Carbo, grab your duffel bag, I need you to go to Omaha, or I need you to go to Eau Claire, Wisconsin, or I need you to go to Hutchinson, Minnesota, or I need you to go, all these little small towns where the spot shows took place.
Mm-hmm.
And Kenny would grab his bag with his trunks, his boots, and head out after working a long, maybe, 10, 12-hour day, 16-hour day landscaping. And he'd head out to this little town, go in, do his, 20 minutes or whatever it was that he had on the card, and then drive home. And Kenny told me one time when we were talking, he says, that was really rugged at times, because you'd be at a wrestling card, and a lot of fans don't realize that in those days, pro wrestling matches didn't start. The matches didn't start until 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening.
Yeah.
It wasn't a 6, 7 o'clock thing like, a lot of the pay-per-views and all that today, or the auditoriums if they have a house show. And so you're getting there, it's 9 o'clock, you're going to get on at 9:20, 9:30, you're going to do your 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever. Then you got to drive back from Omaha or drive back from Eau Claire. He lived in Bloomington, Minnesota. That's where he lived all these many, 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 many years. So he lives out, they lived out near France and, what's the cross street there? But off of 494 France Avenue, it's in that neighborhood. And that's where Kenny and Diane, his beautiful wife, have their home. So Kenny would be coming in the late hours of the night after working a spot show, and then getting up the next morning and, second verse, same as the first, start the business, the landscaping business.
Yeah.
And then, of course, on Saturday afternoons in the 60s and into the early 70s, the AWA would have their All-Star Wrestling program, which was broadcast live in Minneapolis. And then they would also tape a couple of weeks of shows and interviews and things. So Kenny would get the call, come to the studio. And, on a studio day, he might wrestle once or twice or 3 times. The show we're presently watching, we'd only see once, but he'd have to do 2 or 3 matches.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about Kenny was that during that mainstay career that he had, he probably was the most recognizable of any of the jobbers. And I'm going to call them jobbers for this show, for this segment today, because Kenny was proud of that.
Yeah.
And he was probably the most recognizable, other than, I said, George Godasky a little earlier. And George left us many, many years back already. But Kenny was recognizable. And you know what his appeal was? Is that Kenny could wrestle.
Mm-hmm.
And he would get in the ring, he would get that introduction. Back in the 60s and the early 70s, I can still hear Marty O'Neill. Believe it or not, he was billed out of Cleveland, Ohio in the early days. And Marty would say, in this corner at 228 pounds from Cleveland, Ohio, the very capable Kenny J. And Kenny'd give you that thumbs up, like he did. And he'd be in the ring with the Nick Bockwinkel's, the Ray Stevens, the Mad Dogs, the Crushers, Vern Gagne many times. He'd wrestle Billy Robinson. He was in the ring with Hennig and Lars Anderson and Buddy Wolf. And the list just goes on and on and on. Dr. X, Bill Watts, you name it. And virtually every wrestler that came through, Kenny worked with them.
Yeah.
Here's the interesting thing is, I guarantee you will never find a wrestler that Kenny worked with, and sadly so many have left us, but any of those that are still with us, you will never find any of them that ever had a single bad word to say about Kenny, that they didn't like working with him, that they didn't like him as a person. He was just a hero. And the fan watching, we understood in those days with the jobber versus the main guy for the TV purposes, we understood that the majority of the time, the jobber was going to get beat. But there was a thing about Kenny J he had that aura about him where he was believable enough that he could make you at home suspend that disbelief for a moment and really think that he had the Mad Dog on the run, or he had Nick Bockwinkel at that disadvantage. And Nick and Dog and whoever his opponents were, they would sell for him. They would let Kenny have his moment.
Yeah.
You can't, and that's out of respect as well. Because tell you right here, I'll be fair. There were a lot of wrestlers, and I'm not going to name names, but a lot of the big names, there were jobbers that they would go in there and they would just take advantage of them. They didn't care. They may not like the guy. They didn't respect that he was even in the business because he didn't do this or do that. And they would just go in there, rough him up a little bit, send the guy home with a need for Excedrin and whatever else. Kenny J, they never did that. Harley Race, we don't need to say anything more about him than he's a legend. Harley paid Kenny J one of the highest compliments. He said that Kenny was one of the best underrated workers that he had worked with when he was in the AWA. That says mountains to the credibility of Kenny. And Dr. X, Dick Beyer, he worked with Kenny a number of times. And it was always that believability that, oh my goodness, is Kenny going to have the chance here? Is he going to beat Doc on TV? Dr. X told me, he said, of all the guys that he worked with, the under guys that he worked with, he said Kenny was his favorite. And we're moving ahead just a little bit here, but Kenny used to have an annual histiocytosis benefit. Histiocytosis is a very rare blood disorder that normally affects younger children.
Okay.
And it's very devastating for young kids. Well, Kenny's grandson had come down with this disease many, many years ago. And so Kenny got right on it and he started holding these histiocytosis annual fundraisers. And he would get to the local Legion in Bloomington or Savage. He'd put on a big program. He would invite all of the local wrestlers that were living here in the Twin Cities. And, over the years, we had guys like Greg Gagne and Vern Gagne and Red Bastien and Stan Kowalski and Larry Hennig and Steve Olsanowski and Jim Brunzell. I think I said Greg Gagne. Mad Dog would come. And, if I leave off a couple, but these were all local guys that would come for Kenny to be there to sign autographs and be with the fans and promote and all their proceeds that they would sell their merchandise with, they would donate it to the histiocytosis. Well, when I mentioned Dr. X, Dick Beyer, lived in Buffalo, New York, around the Buffalo, New York area. And every year when Kenny had this, and Kenny had, I think there were maybe 15, 16, 17 years worth of these benefits. Dr. X would fly into Minneapolis on his own dime, specifically to attend that event. He came in as Dr. X at the benefit and everything. And he was there. And he did it on his own dime because he said Kenny J was his friend. And he was going to do this for Kenny. Now, he was the only wrestler that, like I said, all these others were local. I mean, they were in driving distance coming to the event. And God bless everyone that came. I mean, that says, a lot for Kenny and the love they had for him, too. But Doc came in. And I just have to tell you one funny story. One night in the Bloomington Legion, and this is many years ago in the early part of these histiocytosis things, it was downstairs in the Legion, and Dr. X comes down the steps and comes around the corner, and in his true Dr. X voice, he goes, "I'm looking for Kenny J." And everybody knew he was there. And Doc he'd have a t-shirt on, a Dr. X t-shirt, and he would go around and have all the wrestlers that attended sign his shirt.
Okay.
And then he would auction that shirt off at the end of the evening to fans and raise money.
Wow.
And I remember there was one of the events where Doc had done this, and somebody ended up paying $150 for this t-shirt, just a
Wow.
t-shirt.
Yeah.
And Larry Hennig used to come in and do the auction because he was an auctioneer, real estate person,
Yeah.
in
Wow.
his
Yeah,
sideline group. So Larry would be the auctioneer. It was a great event. So that's what I wanted to say about that.
Yeah.
The other thing about Kenny, when we talk about the efforts that he put into any wrestling card, I first met Kenny in person. I'd seen him all through the 60s. But in 1970, in April, I had promoted a card in my hometown then of Cottage Grove, Minnesota. And I did this along with the Cottage Grove Police Department. They were doing a fundraiser. And we got together and I went and set it up with the wrestling office to put this card on at my gymnasium at Park High in Cottage Grove. And I ended up with the card that they gave me, and Kenny J was going to be in the opener of my card. And that was the first night I met Kenny, because I was back in the locker rooms with the wrestlers when they showed up. And I'll tell you what, this was one night, long story short, I had a couple wrestlers that didn't appear on the card. Program subject to change right before the card.
Yeah.
Pepper Gomez was one of them. And actually, Pepper was there, but the doc told me he was going to wrestle against Dr. X in the main event. And I got the call back, and Doc says, Pepper can't wrestle. He's got an inner ear infection. It's really got him. He can't wrestle, but Pepper was there. He said, so we're going to change the card. He said, oh, and the other bad news is Blackjack Lanza is stranded in Chicago. Can't make it. Well, that story I felt was false. That's the old he missed the airplane story, because that was used a lot. But needless to say, Lanza, who was going to be in the middle match on the card, was going to wrestle against Bob Windham. Now, later on, Bob Windham became Blackjack Mulligan. But he and Lanza wrestled a lot when Bob was here and got a lot of his training from Vern. Well, Bob was going to wrestle Lanza. So now I got Pepper Gomez gone, and I got Lanza gone. So Doc says to me in his infinite wisdom, he says, so what we're going to do is we're going to put me, meaning himself, me and Bob Windham against Kenny J and Lee Matson. Lee Matson was going to originally be Jay's opponent. Lee Matson was a journeyman wrestler that was at the very, very end of his career. So, just at that point, really not a name. But he was going to go against Jay. Well, that was going to be the main event. They were going to put the two of them together. Lanza, or Windham and Doc against Matson and Jay, and I couldn't deal with it. I said, I don't know where I got the courage. But I said to Doc, could we do it differently? Yeah, I don't care. What do you want to do? I said, well, could we put you, meaning Doc, could we put you and Matson against Windham and Jay? And I said, my rationale is that way we've got a top tier wrestler on both teams, meaning Windham and Doc. Well, that's how Doc says, well, yeah, whatever you want to do, I don't care. So I made that card, that night.
There you go.
Well, when we got to the main event, I am here to tell you, and I'm not just saying this because I had a hand in putting this card together. I'm saying it because I sat there and I was in awe. I love tag team wrestling. That's my forte anyway.
Right.
And Windham and Jay against Doc and Matson was absolutely just one of the most entertaining and fun matches that I had ever seen. And I was 20 years old or whatever I was at that time. So that was my first meeting with Kenny J, and I thanked him afterwards. I said, oh my gosh, Kenny, you were great. He was in the main event, and Kenny sold. And and Doc sold for him. I mean, it was a good match. So that's where I met him that first time. But you know, a lot of fans are not going to remember Kenny as anything but the jobber or enhancement talent. And there are those that will remember he had his moments and Vern took care of him in some cases. One match in August of 1965, Crusher and Vern were feuding with the Dolly sisters, Larry Hennig and Harley Race, Pretty Boy and Handsome. Crusher called them the Dolly sisters. And they had ended up having their third partner, Chris Markoff, interfere in their match. And so Crusher said him and Vern wanted to take all three of the Dolly sisters on. And Tarbo come out and said, well, Crusher, Vern, you got to have a third partner. You can't have 2-on-3, you know, even though they did this stuff sometimes, but this night they couldn't. And Crusher said, well, we take them on by ourselves. Vern says he's fine. Well, they had to get a partner. Well, they told everybody, all right, we'll get a partner. We're not going to tell you who it is. We're not going to tell you our partner. And they did this for, you know, like 2 weeks right before the night of the Minneapolis card. Fans didn't know until we got to the auditorium that night. And Vern and Crusher come out with Kenny J.
Oh, wow. Awesome.
Now here's the thing. Hennig and Race are livid. They're in the ring, Markoff, they're in the ring kicking the ropes, and they're upset because they think Crusher and Vern are trying to embarrass them. You know, they're pulling something underhanded here, bringing in Kenny J, who in their minds didn't, you know, for wrestling storyline doesn't count. Kenny can't beat anybody, you know. So it's a 2-out-of-3 fall tag team match. The falls go back and forth between the two teams on fall 1 and fall 2. Well, we get to the third fall. Vern and Crusher, they're cleaning house, and Jay's had his chance to get in a little bit here and there. And Vern tags off to Kenny J after he had taken Harley Race down, and he tags into Kenny J. Kenny comes in, gets on top of Harley Race. 1, 2, 3. Kenny got the victory. Now,
that's great.
They gave Kenny the fall. And to me, that was kudos to Vern and even Crusher and Hennig and Race and Markoff as well. They put Kenny over. Well, that led up to the storyline too, because they were embarrassed, you know, the Hennig and Race and Markoff. But Kenny was jubilant, you know, he's in the ring. And I sat ringside. I was there. And I'll tell you what, there was not a fan in that auditorium that wasn't excited for Kenny J. And when Kenny's jumping around after he won, I swear to God, you'd have thought he just won the world championship.
Yeah.
And that was one of those special times. Kenny also had some moments on TV where I mentioned George Godasky. Kenny and George made a good babyface tag team on TV every now and then. I mean, they weren't a regular. Every now and then they'd appear as a team. Well, there's one match that's out there where they were wrestling against Jesse Ventura and Adrian Adonis. And through it all, in the end, Jay and Godasky ended up winning the match. Of course, leading to some real heat, you know.
Yeah.
And so Kenny and George got that victory. And every once in a while on TV, Vern would have Kenny win a match. And usually it was against a fellow jobber, but, you know, just a fill match at the end of the evening's TV taping or something. But Kenny had his share. And he was just such a jubilant guy to be around. In 1976, when Vince McMahon Sr. was venturing into the closed circuit television, which was really new at that point in time, he was going to promote the Muhammad Ali boxer versus Antonio Inoki wrestler mixed match. And this was going to be the big deal. It would take place in Japan, and then each city that carried the matches, each territory would put on their own undercard.
Okay.
And usually it was showing through closed circuit. So what we had in Minnesota here, we had a live card from Chicago, which we've seen in I seen in St. Paul at the auditorium on closed circuit TV, a live card from Chicago, and then the feed from New York, which had Chuck Wepner, the boxer, against Andre the Giant in that match from New York. And then the main event came from Tokyo with Inoki versus Ali. But here was where Kenny got a good rub here. They were doing some advertising for it as it was being built up, the closed circuit. And they had a workout series in Chicago. Vern Wally called Kenny, told him they want him to fly to Chicago with his wrestling gear. And Kenny was going to have a sparring workout with Muhammad Ali. And this is on YouTube. People can go out and look at this. Kenny's in the ring as a wrestler. They had Vern Gagne as his second, kind of the referee. Ali, I believe he had Freddie Blassie in his corner, because this is promoted by Vince McMahon now, the actual match.
Yeah.
So Vern is there with Kenny J as he's doing his workout with, and I'm going to tell you, if anybody goes to YouTube and finds it, it's very entertaining. You can see Kenny gets a couple of good jabs in there, and Kenny looks great. The other side of that was they also had Buddy Wolf come to Chicago for that workout. And Dick the Bruiser worked as his second, and Buddy Wolf had some sparring workout sessions against Ali in the ring. And then the big event took place. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I thoroughly enjoyed Kenny's performance with Ali. And he was so proud of that for all the rest of the years of his life, that he had that opportunity. And then the Buddy Wolf working out with Ali, I can guarantee you that both of those were 110% better than the Ali versus Inoki match that took place, which I sat through for 1 solid hour. It went to a draw. And for those that didn't see it, Inoki laid on his back the entire night on the canvas with his legs up trying to kick Ali. In other words, I'm not going to let you punch me. I'm going to try to trip you. I'm going to try to bring you down. It was the most boring thing. I am serious. I would have rather sat outside and watched my lawn grow. And it was awful. You like that scenario, huh?
Yeah,
but and most people will tell you it was a financial debacle. It was a mess.
Yeah.
But the Kenny J workout, and that was another time that Kenny got the kudos. So what we're talking about here is a guy who, in the jobber world of pro wrestling, Kenny wasn't full-time in the business. He didn't want to be full-time in the business. He couldn't be full-time in the business because he was very committed to his family. He was committed to his landscaping business. And he just did this as a sideline and had fun doing it and made so many friends, so many wrestlers that just appreciate him. And to know Kenny, like I say, if you had a chance to meet him, you thought you've known him for 20 years and he was your best friend. And it didn't matter if he wasn't. And for those that were his friends, it's very sad. I am not ashamed to say that there have been wrestlers that have passed over the last decade or two. At times I've actually shed tears. I mean, it's part of my family because that's what I grew up with. And as I said in a Facebook post, if people understood any part of my young childhood, growing up years, I should have been a hoodlum and in jail or been a drug addict. And I wasn't. And the reason, and I say this with all sincerity, the reason I wasn't, it was because of pro wrestling. These guys, and I told this to Dr. X one time. I said, I don't think you or any of your fellow wrestlers can ever totally understand the impact that you had, certainly on me, but I'm sure many others, and you were a drug that I got addicted to, and you saved me. And of course, Brian, I live it and breathe it to this very day. Not the current product, not the current product,
Old
but
school.
I research it. I love it. I live it. I talk it. I write about it. Yep. And Kenny J was one of those guys. And when I did one of my results, AWA record books, the third one, the 1975 to 1979 edition, I went to Kenny J. That's why I want to bring this back to Kenny. I went to Kenny J and I said, first of all, I had Larry Hennig do the foreword for the first book, the 60s. Larry wrote the foreword because I figured he was a big part of the 60s. The first half of actually it was the 74 to 70, the 70 to 74 edition that I asked Kenny to do it for. I had Kenny do it for that one. And then I had Jim Brunzell do the 75 edition. So I went to Kenny and I asked him, I said, Kenny, I have a big favor to ask of you. I showed him my previous book and I said, I would really be honored if you would do a foreword for me for the book. Now, Kenny you could see he was like, what? He probably didn't even know what a foreword was. He wasn't a writer. He goes, and he literally said to me, and I have it right here. He says, all through the years, I had received calls to go to the local TV station to wrestle on All-Star Wrestling. But doing a foreword was one job I have never done. And well, he did the foreword, and I have it here, a copy of it, front and back. It's 2 pages. He did the foreword, got it from him. I put it in the book. At one of his histiocytosis benefits, I got a hold of him. I said, Kenny, I want to give you a personal copy of the book. I said, your foreword's in there, and you know how much I appreciated you doing it. I wish I could have had just a little 3 or 4 minute video of his reaction, because he was so happy. He said, I can't believe you put me over like this. I said, Kenny, this is you. You did this. I said, this is you. And then I asked him to sign a personal copy to me that I keep for myself. And he signed it. And he thanked me for that opportunity. But it all comes around to when I heard that Kenny had passed. Lorraine and I, my wife and I, we get Christmas cards every year from a number of the wrestlers. And I'm always sad when they pass, because then, we no longer get a card from them. We might get it from their wife or something like that, which is awesome. I still get Darlene Bockwinkel and so on. And from Dick's wife, Wilma, I get a card from her and the family. Every year I've gotten one from Kenny and Diane Benkowski. And we got our one here in just a couple months ago, month and a half ago at Christmas. And I save them. They become part of each wrestler's file that I have for them. But I was very sad when I heard that he passed. And I feel like I lost a really good friend, and just such a great ambassador for pro wrestling. Kenny was never about putting Kenny J over. And he talked to you as plain as you were the best friend. And, in our world, Brian, and this isn't a soapbox, but in our world today, where we have so many people that are brought down off the pedestals, when we have people that are cheating and lying and killing and whatever, it's heartwarming to know that there were people like Kenny J, who was a warm, decent, kind, generous human being. And as I said in one thing on Facebook, after he passed, I said, God needed a champion. He just put the title on Kenny J.
There you go. Yeah.
And I get a tear when I say
I can see it. If you're watching, you can see emotional. I've only met the man once, and that was, like I said, a couple years ago in Crusher Fest in Milwaukee. But his wife was there, his daughter was there, his son-in-law was there. He was just as happy as he could be. He took pictures with everybody. You know, had this some guy had a older WWF title, and he asked Kenny to hold it and take a picture with it. He did, and just a night. He had these books too. He was selling a bunch of his photos. Made a little book, had a bunch of them, and it was just.
I actually had a fan send me a text. That little book you're talking about sent me a text yesterday and said he wanted to know if I had one. He wants to send it to me.
Yeah, I don't have one. I wish I did. I didn't have the opportunity to get it, or I would have. I was just doing other stuff, unfortunately. But and his family was so nice. I mean, we were at the hotel. His wife would talk to me 10 minutes about, you know, his career and how, you know, what he did, and it was just a very, you could tell there was a very loving family, and he's a very kind person. And I always loved Kenny J on AWA. When I was a little kid, I'll just tell a quick story and I'll give it back to you. But there was a match with him, and I don't remember his tag team partner right now, but it was against the Vachons.
Okay.
And it was a 2 out of 3 falls match. And you know, the first fall, it went pretty quick. They got beat, but the second fall, Mad Dog, all of a sudden, you know, Kenny just hit him just right. And he starts doing his, you know, he's selling it, you know, that he's getting beat up pretty bad. And then Butcher comes in and takes Kenny off of Mad Dog every time he gets ready to pin him. And it was just, they ended up getting beat again, but it was just such, like you said earlier about selling. Those guys liked and respected Kenny J so much that they would sell. You know, and that's the amazing part is I remember Kenny J. I mean, most people probably don't, but I do. And the Sodbuster, he was just a very he was very appreciated, but I think he's underrated. And I think you're right. I think if he would have sacrificed his family time, he probably would have been a bigger star, but he didn't want to do that, and I don't blame him. You know, your family you have, you know, until you're gone, pretty much. You know, the business, once you're done with it, that's it. You're just you're a memory. And so I understand why he did that, and I don't blame him one bit. He will be missed. And he's a good man. He was a good man, and he had a great family. So I'm giving it back to you, George.
Well, I think the thing that you touch on, and you're so right, in the wrestling business, and most wrestlers will tell you that to have a home life, a normal home life, to even, you know, I've had wrestlers tell me, if you're going to be a wrestler, don't get married. I mean, because you're not going to see your wife. I've had wrestlers tell me, you know, I've got kids, but I don't know them. They don't know me. And, you know, they have broken marriages and that sort of thing. And there's a bunch of guys in the business who took the family aspect of it all. When it all comes down to it, that's all that matters is your family and your kids and your spouse. And Kenny was very committed to that. And like I say, when you're out, if you see Kenny, you see Diane. If you see Diane, you see Kenny. Yep. And most often, like I say, I don't know his other 2 children, but I do know Lori, and she's always with him too, her and her husband. And you know, it's so warm to see that.
Yeah.
So what this all comes down to is, again, because we had such an unassuming man, and I want to say one more thing. When you talk about the guys selling for Kenny, because I touched on that earlier.
Yep.
They did that because they did appreciate Kenny, and that Kenny was a good guy and he could work and he was credible. You know, you really could believe he could win, and he could have. Where there were other jobbers, and I don't say this to insult them, because as I said, I have respect for anyone that put those boots on. But there were jobbers that you could see from the ring of the bell that, how did this guy even get in the ring? You know, they're awkward. They move. They have no moves. They can't do anything. And a lot of times the guys, as I said, they just go in there, bang, 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 clobber the guy, get done. and I'm not going to waste
Yeah.
any time with this guy.
Yeah.
And so Kenny wasn't that guy. Kenny was
No.
one of the boys. He had a trip to Japan in 1972. He went with some of the AWA guys because remember they used to go on these tours, 6-8
Yeah.
week tours to Japan, American
Mhm.
wrestlers. Kenny was in a main event in a cage match against Japanese wrestler Rusher Kimura. I probably messed up his last name, but it was a cage match. Kenny was in the main event. It's on, you can see that there's references to it. I think I put a picture on my page. But
Okay.
he teamed up over there with King Curtis Iakia and a few other guys. But Kenny he talked about that. He loved that Japan tour. So here's the bottom line. This unassuming man who had not one little bit of an ego.
Yeah.
When I was chatting with his daughter, Lori, wanting to find out when the service or memorial or whatever they were going to do. Well, it is set up now and it is posted out there for folks on my page and the AWA page.
Okay.
His service, memorial service is going to be very simple, Kenny J like. It's going to be at the Savage, Minnesota American Legion. And on February 26th, Sunday, from 4 to 8 p.m.
Okay.
And I can tell you right now, and Lorraine and I will be there, of course.
Yeah.
But I can tell you right now that you are going to see just a gathering of friends, other wrestlers that, will come that are still with us. And it's going to just be just what Kenny wanted. And Lori told me, his daughter, she says, that's what Dad wanted.
Yeah.
And I'm all for it.
Yeah.
If Kenny wanted that type of a celebration, just come out and have a beer on me. How beautiful is that?
Yeah.
So, yeah, we lost a great guy. Not only just a wrestler, but we lost a man who proves that you don't have to have a title to be great, or you don't have to boast of who you are, what you are. Just be yourself. And to Kenny J, and certainly to Diane, Lori, the rest of the family, I just say thank you so much for sharing, Kenny J. And most of all, I feel like I'm blessed to have his friendship.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah.
That's where I'm leaving it.
All right. Thank you, George, for coming on. I want to thank everybody. This is you bet. This is a special edition. If you're watching, you'll see my background is blank because we just moved into a new place. So hopefully next time we have a show, it should be up and running. But excuse me, George just called me the other day and wanted to do a special show. So I really appreciate that. He called me, he could have called anybody. And I appreciate that, George. I really do.
Well, I just thought it's not me that wants to do a show. It was, I appreciate, I appreciate your show and what you do and how you do it, and your longevity. And I just felt that I felt the need to share Kenny, to share about him. He deserves it. I wish I could do more. Just a great man.
He was and always will be in the hearts and minds of many fans. And I'll tell you what, I didn't even know it. Like I said, we were moving and George called me and told me about his passing. I was shocked. But he was a great guy. I only met him once, like I said. I mean, I've seen him on TV, but I've always heard good things about Kenny J, the Sodbuster. So, and George, I know he's a good friend of yours because you're pretty emotional. If you're watching this, you'll see how George is pretty emotional about it. And that says a lot right there. So thanks again, George, for doing this today. I appreciate it. And if you're out there, folks, and you're near you bet. And if you're out there, I'll have this posted here and all the information, George's page and stuff, so you can find out if you want to attend his visitation or funeral or reception. do it, folks. If you're a fan, especially, there'll be people there. And
Yeah,
unfortunately, I live
at the Legion.
Okay, I won't be there. Unfortunately, I live too far away, or else I would. But one more time, George Schire, thank you. Kenny J.
Thank you, Ryan.
If I had a timer bell, I'd ring it the 10 times in honor of him. But folks, if
I
you're
should have
watching,
brought
thank
my
you.
bell out. We could have
Yeah,
done
you
it.
should have brought your bell out, but that's okay. You know what, folks, if you're watching, thank you. If you're listening, thank you. If you haven't subscribed, please do so, and we will talk to you soon.
Did you ever wonder what could have been with the AWA had things gone differently? Had their fortunes gone differently? Had certain wrestlers not left and perhaps more money would have been at the disposal of the Gagnes? Well, wonder no further. You can go to Brad Drake's YouTube channel and experience the 1987 Supermod for yourself, as Brad Drake starts off in May 1987 along with Greg Gagne, Baron Von Raschke, Vern Gagne himself, Nick Bockwinkel, Larry Zbyszko, Kurt Hennig, and a slew of others as he plays and saves the AWA.
Hello, everyone. This is Brian Ferguson, the host of Bumps and Thumps, the talk of wrestling. I want to tell you about a new podcast out called Falls Count Anywhere. It is a classic pro wrestling podcast that brings you the legends of wrestling with true wrestling fans Chris DiCarlo and Charlie Turner. They bring on guests that are legends in this business, as well as wrestlers of today, promoters, referees, you name it. They have them on there, folks. And I encourage you to listen to them. If you're on YouTube, watch them. They drop every Saturday. They have their podcast. They drop it in the afternoon. So look forward to that podcast coming out. Falls Count Anywhere podcast with Chris DiCarlo and Charlie Turner. Folks, you will not be disappointed. I guarantee it. And enjoy the podcast.